Welcome to another dose of science, and today maybe a bit of a smaller dose since it's summer. But nevertheless, there is a lot to talk about because COVID is not leaving us alone. Jonathan's back from a couple of weeks of vacation, and what happened? Anything interesting?
I was going to ask you the same question because I was off of Twitter for 2 weeks. I barely looked at the news. So did anybody die? Did any statue get defaced? What happened? What did I miss?
Yes, the James McGill statue got defaced.
And you tried to scrub it clean, apparently.
It's not the only one. Lots of statues got defaced. That's just the closest one to our office.
It is the closest one. And it's been vandalized with some paint that so far has resisted all my solvents. So
I suspect a chemistry student then.
Yes, it is a challenge for sure. And Jonathan, undoubtedly you missed last night. Canadians won.
So what are you mean us as a country? Canadians won?
Yes, I will not elaborate on.
What is this hockey thing you keep referring to? I don't know what that is. War on skates?
I hear there's some really interesting chemistry that goes into that safety glass.
There must be.
There certainly is. There certainly is, and you know that the glass around the rink is actually tempered glass. It is not the traditional safety glass. It's not the same thing that we have on our car windshields, which is quite different. That's made of 2 sheets of glass with a plastic layer in between. The hockey glass is just tempered glass, and that's made by heating up the glass to high temperature and quickly cooling it. That changes the crystal structure. I know people are going to say glass crystal structure. Yes, tempered glass has crystal structure. And the idea behind it is that when it shatters into a million pieces. And, that's not very pleasant when a player gets showered with glass, but it's better than being cut with shards.
Yeah.
All right. A lot of stuff, of course, happening in the COVID world. Some of it quite disturbing, like this one. In India, believe it or not, fake vaccines for a lot of money. And all they're doing is injecting salt water. Of course, you get all the anti-vaxxers jumping up on this and saying it really doesn't matter because it's just as good as the real vaccine.
It's even better because you don't have the risks, Joe.
That's right. That's right. I'm surprised actually that we haven't seen more of this kind of stuff here, but I guess because we actually do have the real vaccine and it's now available, there's no need for the fakes. But India is, of course, a completely different story.
But I do remember there was a video circulating before I went on vacation of somebody had filmed their friend getting vaccinated, and it looked like the person doing the injection was not taking the plunger all the way down, and they were not actually injecting the vaccine. And this was sort of making the rounds, and it wasn't clear if this was one person who had made a mistake once, if this was somebody who was trying to infiltrate the vaccination sites so as not to give people the vaccine to save them, and I don't know whatever happened to that particular story, honestly.
I don't remember any follow-up on it, but I mean, I remember a lot of people trying to say well, these people are nurses and healthcare practitioners, so there's no way they would ever be anti-vaxxers. And unfortunately, that's very much not true. A pharmacist was literally arrested for purposefully spoiling so many doses of this vaccine. So just because you can legally inject someone with a vaccine doesn't mean you believe in vaccines.
Yeah.
Well, you remember there were also those videos which showed that the way that they pinched the arm was not good, because if you pinch it too much when you inject, you're not injecting into the deltoid, you're injecting into the fatty tissue.
Right.
And
that could actually be a real issue.
There could have been something to that. And now, of course, we have the Delta variant, which is kind of scary because there already seems to be an effect, I mean, the latest report from Israel, and they're a very good country to monitor because they have the highest percentage of vaccinated people. And the efficacy of the Pfizer vaccine has gone way down from about 90% to about 60%. And I know this personally because I have a cousin there, and both she and her husband doubly vaccinated, both came down with COVID pretty nastily. So we may have to deal with this. People are kind of relaxing here, but maybe too early. Also, this madness, the Bell Center, they only let 3,500 people in, which I guess you can argue that either way. But the fact is that there's thousands and thousands outside, squeezed together like sardines, breathing into each other's face. We'll see what happens with that.
Yeah, there were even images of like Valerie Plante, the mayor of Montreal, out in those crowds. And you'd be safer at a bar because at least you'd be exposed to fewer people.
Yeah. Some people have this idea that just because you're outside, you're 100% safe. But if you're in my face and I'm spitting in your face and I have the virus, those droplets are getting into your mouth. So outdoors is safer than indoors.
I can tell you how serious I think it is because I actually had an offer to go last night, ticket in the box seats.
And you didn't.
I didn't go. I thought it was, too much of a risk to struggle through the crowd. And also, of course, to potentially put up with the tear gas, which did happen again last night. Wow. The police are very, very quick there to jump. Okay, so let's get some things going here. I got a little bit of a presentation on plastics because there's so much talk about plastics. And I want to take a bit of a look at the history of plastics. So let me just share this screen. Okay, there we go. And it's almost sacrilegious, I think, if you're going to talk about plastics, not to start with the graduate. And generally, when I give a talk on plastics, very often to students, I start with this. And, I'm always mystified by how few of our students, who I guess, mostly are now in their early 20s, have actually seen The Graduate.
I was going to say, your references are leaving your demographic behind now.
Yes.
Yeah.
And also, I guess I forgot to shut off my Outlook, so there may be some dings in the background there. But I've thought that The Graduate is such a classic movie that it would still entice even young people to watch it. Well, maybe they'll be enticed now if we have any young people watching this. In any case, at the beginning of the movie, young Benjamin, who has just graduated from university, is corralled by a family friend. And of course, Benj is looking for a career, and this family friend just whispers one thing into his ear, which is plastics. And this, of course, was in the 1960s, 1967, when plastics were flying high. We were going to Tupperware parties. We were playing with hula hoops. We were collecting Barbie dolls, or some people were. We were wrapping everything in plastic. And we were even wearing polyester suits. And I will admit to having had one of those. We drove around in cars with vinyl roofs. And we listened to vinyl records made, of course, of polyvinyl chloride. And we were totally amazed by the astronauts, the Mercury 7 astronauts, famous at that time. And of course, helmets and suits, all kinds of plastic material. And we were looking at the world through plastic contact lenses. And in 1964, I remember going to New York World's Fair and the DuPont Pavilion. And they still had the classic logo, Better Living Through Chemistry and the Wonderful World of Chemistry. And inside was a theater where we were entertained by dancing molecules who sang about better living through chemistry. And it was the Happy Plastics family. There's nothing to match 1,000 things to do with plastics. There's nothing to beat their skill and versatility. That's why we can tell you we're all enthusiastic about the very significant, truly magnificent Happy Plastics family. It was great entertainment. They told us about the nylon fabrics on the seats, the polyester curtains, the polyurethane cushions, and they sang and they danced. And boy, was that ever different than today. Today, you mention plastics, and we are horrified by what they are doing to the environment. And there are movements to ban plastics, which of course is ridiculous because we have so many useful materials that are made of plastics. Our life could not exist without plastics today. A hospital could not function without plastics, or airplanes and cars could not. But of course, we are reviled by scenes like this, where plastics are disposed in a totally improper fashion, especially the single-use plastics. We see terrible pictures like this: animals enveloped in plastic, sea turtles caught up in netting. Horrible business. But once again, those plastic bags don't jump out of human hands. They do not have a life. It is the human hands that let these go. So people are a problem. It's not the plastics. It is possible to handle plastics properly. Of course, we do have to take a hard look at just where we are using plastics, especially the single-use ones. Believe it or not, there was life before plastic straws. There really was. It is possible to teach people to drink out of a glass without a straw. And now they're replacing the plastic straws with paper straws. That's a problem because in order to make the paper impermeable to water, they're treated with perfluoroalkyl substances, and that, of course, introduces another issue. Today, we know a great deal about polymers, and it's very well-studied science. I mean, thousands of papers published every year on plastics. But let me just tell you a little bit of history of where it all starts. And the modern plastics industry really starts with cellulose, which is the basic building block of plants. And cotton, for example, is essentially cellulose. So our story really starts in 1845 with a Swiss professor of chemistry by the name of Christian Schönbein, who, at least as the legend says, used to take his work home with him. And his work one day was based on mixing nitric acid and sulfuric acid. He unfortunately spilled it on the floor. Well, luckily for him, Frau Schönbein was not home at the time. So he knew that he better clean up this mess before she reappeared. He grabbed the first thing he could, which was his wife's cotton apron. He took the apron and he wiped up the mess, but then he had this wet apron on his hands. What to do? He hung up the apron in front of the fireplace, and he was astonished when it went up in flames without a trace of smoke. Because what he had done was convert the cellulose into nitrocellulose. And for those of you who are chemically inclined, this is a structural diagram of cellulose. And when you treat it with nitric and sulfuric acid, what you do is attach nitro groups. As you can see, those nitro groups contain oxygen, and plus the bond between the oxygen and nitrogen is a very weak bond. So there is easy bond breakage here, and oxygen is readily available for combustion. So this thing burns, and it burns without any smoke. That was very important because Schönbein concluded that therefore this material could be used as smokeless gunpowder. In any case, the next step was to take nitrocellulose and mix it with alcohol, because it turned out that this formed a novel substance called collodion, which was a thin plastic film. This is the first time anyone had ever seen anything like that, and it was used to cover cuts, very much like an early version of a Band-Aid. You could peel it off, and that's what it looks like. And it had quite widespread use. Obviously, there was a problem with this. It was quite flammable. Then along came John Wesley Hyatt, an American inventor, and he was confronted with a rather serious problem: a shortage of elephants. Well, why was that an issue? Because the ivory from the tusks of elephants at the time was used to make billiard balls, which was a very popular pastime. Because there was a shortage of elephants, there was a shortage of billiard balls. So a company, a manufacturer of billiard balls, offered a prize of $10,000 to anyone who could come up with a substitute for the ivory in billiard balls. And Hyatt worked at this, and he discovered that when he took collodion and mixed it with camphor, which is isolated from a tree, he got a new material called celluloid, which could be heated up, molded, cooled down, and celluloid would retain its shape. And sure enough, they started to manufacture billiard balls made out of celluloid. But remember, cellulose nitrate is highly flammable, so celluloid was, if those balls banged together with too much vigor, they would create a spark and the balls would go up in flames. All kinds of materials were made of celluloid, including collars. In those days, gentlemen did not change their shirt every day, but they would change their collar because that was the only thing that showed, because they normally wore a vest. And celluloid was a breakthrough here because it could be washed quite easily and then replaced. But of course, there was a problem here too, because remember that celluloid was flammable. And if you got too hot under the collar, your collar would disappear. But it was heavily advertised. There it is. It was a big commercial success. All kinds of inventive ads for the collars and also for the cuffs. But I think when we mention celluloid, the term that comes to people's mind is celluloid film or celluloid movies. We called it the celluloid era. And indeed, the first film ever made by Thomas Edison, called The Sneeze, it only lasted 10 seconds, and it was a film of his assistant, Frank Ott, sneezing. And the silver chloride, which was the light-sensitive material, was coated onto celluloid. Edison had an idea of how people should watch movies, and he invented the kinemascope. This was a device that you hand cranked and the film would run through it and you would look through a lens. So this was the very early days of the cinema, and people certainly enjoyed this, moving pictures. I mean, that was a great novelty made possible by celluloid. Well, today, celluloid is not much used, except in one connection. Believe it or not, it is the ping pong ball. Because even though we know a great deal about plastics, we have not been able to make a ball as good, a ping pong ball as good as one made of celluloid. However, as you can see here, the problem is that it is highly flammable. And this was the problem with film. Because when you project through film, of course, the film can heat up if it isn't moving rapidly enough in front of the light bulb. And that can cause a fire, and we had a whole slew of fires in movie theaters. In fact, when I came to Canada, which was in the late 1950s, children were not allowed to go to movie theaters because there had been a gigantic fire in which children died. And it was absolutely forbidden for children to go to the theater. Well, today, of course, we no longer have to rely on celluloid film, because we are in a completely different era. We are now in the digital era where no film is used. But it's interesting to hearken back to those days of yore when celluloid ruled the world. It was the king of plastics. So that's the early history of plastics. And I do have something to show you. The early celluloid materials are quite valuable, and they're not easy to find because, of course, flammability means that a lot of them went up in flame, but without smoke. Here's the salt shaker that dates back to the late 1880s, and a jewelry box, very, very light. Cellulose is very, very light, but as you can see, it's very pretty. And it looks like ivory. Of course, it doesn't have the same weight as ivory, but it does look like ivory. So you can imagine that it was highly successful. But there was an issue with it. And that, of course, was the flammability.
Don't set it on fire, Joe.
Well, we'll see. We shall see how this works. So I have a little bit of cotton here that was treated with nitric acid and sulfuric acid. So we're ready for a live experiment. I don't know if this is going to work or not. It's always a problem when you do things live.
Don't do this at home,
here
children.
we go. As you can see, it does burn, and there's essentially no smoke. Well, there's a little bit of smoke because it was not completely nitrated.
Just a little bit.
When you do the nitration reaction, it's kind of finicky because you have to get the stoichiometry quite right. Other than that, the thing starts to run away on you and gets too hot.
What
anyway,
do you mean by stoichiometry for people who are not familiar with the term stoichiometry?
Yes. All right, Ada, you want to explain what stoichiometry is?
He passes it along to the
I'm pretty sure he said. I'm pretty sure he said, Joe, what's stoichiometry? No, so stoichiometry is just you have to balance reactions. So the kind of typical, even if you haven't studied chemistry, you've probably seen like a reaction kind of written down. They've got like arrows, so they'll have like something written, then an arrow, and then something else written. And so like a really basic one you could think of would be like water, which is H2O, 2 hydrogen atoms, 1 oxygen atom, and then an arrow as water breaks down, and it could break down into oxygen gas and hydrogen gas, O2 and H2. Problem is, that means that you have O2, oxygen gas, 2 oxygens, and H2, hydrogen gas, 2 hydrogens, 4 molecules, but there was only 3 in your water molecule. So the stoichiometry is that you have to balance those. So I actually can't balance it in my head because I can't think like that. I think you just need 2 water molecules. I don't know.
Yes.
But you have to balance the reaction so that you have the proper amount of water breaking down into the proper amount of products. And so we call that number
there we have an explanation
the
of stoichiometry. All right. So let's try to find if we can a segue from stoichiometry to what Jonathan is going to talk about.
Speaking of numbers.
Speaking of balancing what goes in with what comes out, which is not always what happens. Yeah, so can you guys see my slides on the COVID app? Let me go to, there we go. Yeah, I just wanted to briefly mention some data that's been reported on just a few days ago on the COVID Alert app. So this app came out a little while ago, I think something like almost a year ago. And I downloaded it on my phone. I even talked about it on CTV News, I remember. And the idea was a very, very good one, which is that you know, you want to know if you've come into contact with somebody who has been diagnosed with COVID-19 so that you can quarantine and not infect further people. And so the way that this particular app works is that it uses, you know, the wireless technology of the phone, and it exchanges these random numbers, these codes between your phone and nearby phones. And so if I were to test positive for COVID-19, I can ask the public health agency for this key is what it's called. So it's a string of numbers and letters, I assume. I've never had to do it. I haven't been diagnosed with COVID-19. But then when you get this from the health agency after they've confirmed that you have been diagnosed with COVID-19, you enter this into your app. And now your phone is essentially sending out the signal that you have COVID-19 right now. And if you, Ada, were to come into contact with me, if you have the app on your phone and you're within 2 meters of me for 15 minutes or longer, the phone knows that my code is positive for COVID-19 and will tell you you have come into contact with somebody who has been diagnosed with COVID-19. You should quarantine for 2 weeks. You should get tested, et cetera, et cetera. And so this was, I mean, and we're not the only country that has enacted this kind of digital technology for essentially for checking for exposure. And it was a good idea. Now the question is, has it done what we wanted this app to do? And so a few days ago, La Presse on the French side came up with this. They came out with this particular article. The Montreal Gazette followed suit, and essentially the results are not encouraging. Which is that in terms of spendings for this app, $15.9 million were spent on publicity alone to promote the use of this app. Now, it may sound like a lot, but we also have to understand that, you know, the way for this app to work is for as many Canadians to download it onto their phones, because if nobody's using it, then it's not fulfilling its job. So you do need to publicize it, to talk about it, to get people to download it. So 15.9 million versus 3.5 million that was used for the maintenance of the app, for testing internally, for the people who were in charge of this, for their salaries. So it's about $20 million that was spent on this app. And so what do we have to show for it? Only about 1 in 5 Canadians with a mobile phone actually downloaded the COVID Alert app, which is not a lot. And so again, it's not 1 in 5 Canadians per se, just 1 in 5 Canadians who have a mobile phone onto which the app could be downloaded actually did download this app. So it's a minority, right? It's 20%. And if you go on the official website for this app and you look at the number of times that that keys were used, right? So that somebody was diagnosed with COVID-19, they ask for this key, they put it into the app to let other people know that they had been diagnosed with COVID-19. There have only been 33,991 keys, basically, given to people. So that means that only 2.4% of confirmed COVID-19 cases in Canada were declared in that app. And so they estimate that at best, roughly 1% of people, so 1 in 100 who installed the app actually did end up receiving an alert that they had been near a confirmed case. So these are very small numbers. Now, of course, the app was not meant to be the be-all and end-all of protecting Canadians from exposure to the coronavirus. They were part of a number of measures, but it's kind of underwhelming to look at this. And so questions that are being asked as well, what should we do moving forward? What should we do in a new pandemic? And some people have said that it's possible that the app might find better use in more targeted environments where you have maybe better control of who installs the app. Maybe it's a higher risk situation, maybe like long-term care homes. If the residents there have these cell phones, or at least for the staff, but its use by Canadians at large has been very underwhelming. So there you go. It was the first big pandemic in 100 years, and we've tried a number of different things. And I still think that the idea of this app is very good, but of course it is dependent on people actually adopting this measure and installing the app and keeping it running in the background, which most Canadians with a cell phone were just not willing to do, I guess.
You may have super technology, but it doesn't do anything if you don't use it, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Did you install the app, Joe?
Yes, I have the app, but I haven't used it.
You too, John? Listen.
I did. I installed it. Once in a while, I get a little message saying it's still running in the background, still checking for exposures. But I never once had a positive signal saying you need to quarantine. But yeah, it's on my phone. It's there. But again, if not enough people download it, then its use is going to be very, very limited.
Well, talking about the potential spread of the disease, the Olympics are coming up. And obviously, there's a lot of controversy there because although they're not going to allow foreigners to come in as tourists, but there'll be a lot of athletes, and whether or not they're going to be able to isolate themselves when necessary, hard to know. But there are other issues, of course, that arise whenever the Olympics are mentioned, and the possibility of doping and trying to take advantage chemically instead of through training. Ada.
Yeah, so there's been 2 really interesting cases come up in the last 2 weeks since we recorded one of these. So one big one is with Shikari Richardson, which a lot of people kind of saw her story because it was for a long time right after she won being used as a very feel-good story because her birth mother died just right as she was competing, and she was actually informed of that by a reporter, which is awful, not how somebody should have to learn that information. And right after she won the race, she actually ran straight to her grandmother. So a lot of people were really touting her race as a very big, her qualifying race is a very big feel-good story. And then her drug test came back positive for THC, and she was completely disqualified. That is interesting for several reasons. One of which being that THC can stay in your body for up to 28 days, or even longer, potentially. 28 is kind of the general recognized most people will have it through their system by then. But in studies, I've seen reports of it being present up to 3 months, 90 days after consumption. That largely has to do with the fact that THC is fat soluble as opposed to water soluble. So it stays in your fat cells. And so it's just harder in general for your body to eliminate it. The other thing is that she did this. So she smoked a joint. She did so after being told by a reporter that her mother was dead. So we can kind of understand where her mental trauma was coming from. She also did it in a state where it's legal. So she did not break the law. She broke the Olympics rules, but she did not break the law.
Let me ask you a question, Ada. So I remember a bit by Robin Williams as a stand-up comedian where he was arguing that cannabis is not a performance-enhancing drug. Talk about somebody behind the wheel under the influence of pot, and it does not enhance your performance. So is THC a performance-enhancing drug? Yeah,
so that was where I was going next, because she didn't break the law. She only broke the Olympics rules. They're actually not the Olympics rules. They're the IAAF, I wrote it down because I keep forgetting. The International Association of Athletics Federation. That's the association that you mean when people say the Olympics. It's the IAAF. And it's against the rules. They say it's a performance enhancing drug. There are so many studies that show that weed is not a performance enhancing drug. Not cannabis consumed in any of the ways that people usually consume cannabis, like edible, topical, smoked. Not if you isolate the compounds and give people just CBD or THC or any of the other many cannabinoids. Just in general, if you ask anyone who smokes pot whether or not they think they could run faster after consuming it, they would laugh at you. They would just
continue laughing for hours because it's high on pot.
The only event where there is the possibility of some enhancement is in shooting, where it will steady your hands.
Oh, interesting.
Potentially. So this
archery also apparently.
Same principle. Yeah. You could imagine it for other similar. I'm not even up to date anymore on what the Olympic sports are, but for things like even curling, things that involve less physical activity, more kind of skills as opposed to. Anyways, the point is, a lot of people, the general consensus is either falling under she broke the rules, she has to suffer the consequences, or this is a really, really stupid rule and it makes no sense to disqualify her for this. No matter what you think, at least most people can agree that the rule exists for a reason. They don't necessarily agree that it should exist, but they said weed it's a substance that people could be using and we don't want our athletes using it. On the other hand, the other big reason that people have been excluded from the Olympics this week is much less understandable, and that's testosterone. So notably, two sprinting stars from Namibia, Christine Boma and Beatrice Masalingi. They have both been disqualified for displaying natural too high levels of testosterone. So they are, according to the Olympics, the IAAF, not women, even though they are they are women in every possible. The idea of what it means to be a woman is a contentious idea, but no matter what definition you come up with, except their testosterone level, they are women. They were born as women, called women their whole lives. They identify as women. They have all of the reproductive parts that a person assigned female at birth would have, but their testosterone levels are over 5 nanomoles per liter. And that is the limit that the Olympics put on somebody who wants to be considered female. And it's really interesting because they claim, so they've been accused of making that limit kind of arbitrary. And they really don't like that. They specifically don't like the word arbitrary.
So is the idea that anything above that is impossible to be achieved naturally by a woman, therefore she must be doping?
Yes, she's either doping or she has some disorder of the reproductive or general sex characteristics.
Which gives her an unfair advantage.
Yes, that's the thing. It's unfair advantage.
Right. I see.
It's women do not display testosterone levels of this high. Therefore, someone displaying this testosterone level cannot compete with the women, except for the fact that women do display testosterone levels that high. So the IAAF says that the number is not arbitrary and that 5 nanomoles per liter is based on a comprehensive survey of all reliable reported data, which establishes that female athletes with ovaries will usually have testosterone in the range of 0.06 to 1.6 nanomoles. So 0.6 to 1.6 is a fair bit lower than the 5. That's the limit. However, they seem to just either have bad data or be lying when they say that that is based on all available data, because there was a 2014 study, a very, very large study, 813 elite athletes with blood samples taken within 2 hours of competing at national or international competitions. And more than 14% of women had a value above the upper limit of the female testosterone range. And it's important to note that the upper limit of the female testosterone range, as defined for this paper, was 7, not 5 nanomoles per liter. So if you defined it as 5, it would be more than 14%. So there's a pretty sizable number of women who are naturally, through no doping mechanism, through nothing they're doing, displaying these testosterone levels. And so essentially what we're coming down to is we're policing gender based on hormone levels under this guise that increased testosterone levels directly correlates to increased athletic performance, which is not actually proven at all. It's a messy link. Studies trying to show it have shown maybe sort of trends. The problem is there's just about 1 billion conflating factors. Genetic factors alone mean that different levels of testosterone affect different people very, very differently and in different parts of their body. For me, a level of 5 nanomoles per liter could be a very high testosterone level, but for another cisgendered woman, that could be a very low level because bodies naturally react to different levels of hormones in different ways. But even if you want to ignore all the hormone stuff and all that, there are so many conflating variables, diet, climate, background, that are shown to be much more important in determining who's going to win competitions rather than hormone levels. So they try to say that we have to regulate these hormone levels in order to keep competition fair, right? But we're not regulating things like the diets they eat or the other medications they take that aren't illegal doping drugs, or how they were raised, or how they got to the competition that day, or how their mental sanity is. There are so many other factors that are so much more important than testosterone. Right. This is just the one we're focusing on.
Time for me to chime in with my Olympic experience.
You ran in the Olympics?
Oh, yes. 1976, when we had the Olympics here, I had the job in a lab of injecting samples from the athletes into a gas chromatograph.
Oh.
And this was in really the early days of testing. We were testing really for amphetamines mostly. There were no reliable tests for steroids in those days. But I remember Cornelia Ender, the East German swimmer, because the athletes actually brought their vials into lab.
Oh, wow.
And she looked like a man. There was no question. Her shoulders were broad, the arms were powerful. I mean, she looked like a man weightlifter. And she won 4 medals. Not surprising. And later, of course, we found out that these Germans were doping like crazy. So were the Russians, but we weren't able to detect it at that time. But the greatest problem, believe it or not, was with the Russians, to get them to pee into a bottle, because they constantly complained that no, they couldn't do it because they didn't want to do it. Molson came to the rescue, offered free beer as much as they could have. And after that, there was never a problem with the Russians peeing into bottles.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. Today, of course, all the testing is far, far more sophisticated. And, in those days, to test for nanomoles of testosterone would have been just out of the question. And today, routine.
Exactly.
So testing has evolved.
I'll just end the Olympics segment of our presentation with this kind of fascinating fact, which is that due to the testosterone issues and due to the THC issues, the 400-meter race at this year's Olympics will not feature any of the top 7 fastest 400-meter sprinters from around the world, because they have all been disqualified.
Wow.
Well, I think we're going to have a very bizarre kind of Olympics, because a lot of the top athletes are just not going.
Yeah.
Okay. We're going to wind up here, but of course we don't want to wind up without Ada's animal fact.
Oh, yes, I get to keep talking. So,
keep talking.
It's about bees. Who doesn't love a good bee? Well, if you don't love bees, you probably love honey, which is good because bees make a lot of it. And actually, someone asked me on Twitter last week why bees make more honey than they need. Basically, they were trying to parse whether a lot of vegans, it's a big debate in the vegan community, should I eat honey or not? It's technically an animal product, as in it's made by animals, but it doesn't seem to harm the bees to take it. So is it really bad? Personally, that's where I'm at, because we know that bees do overproduce honey quite a bit. They produce far more than they need to actually feed their colony. As for the why, better question would be why not? It would be really weird if they did stop, because no animal stops just because they have enough stored for winter. Squirrels don't stop burying nuts because they think they've buried enough. Bears don't stop eating because they've decided their fat stores are enough for them to hibernate. It's kind of just in basic animal hoarding behavior to keep hoarding until you can't hoard anymore. So it kind of makes perfect sense that bees will get as much pollen as they can and therefore produce as much honey as they can, which happens to be quite a bit more than they need. And also through artificial selection, because honeybees they're not domestic to Canada, they're essentially cattle. They're far more like to cows than they are to the native bee populations because they're agricultural animals. So through artificial selection, just as we keep the hives alive that produce the best honey, we've selected for bees that produce more honey. So they do naturally produce enough honey that we can take some without an issue, but also we've bred bees that are better at producing extra honey so we can steal some.
So vegans can eat delicious honey is what Ada is saying.
That I would argue very hard that smart vegans would eat honey.
So only the dumb ones don't eat honey is what you're saying. We can plaster this all over the internet. If you're a vegan and you don't eat honey, you're dumb.
Yep, that's it. That's 100%. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Have you ever put honey on buttered bread?
Yeah.
No, why would you do such a thing?
All right.
Have you really not, Jonathan?
You go and try, and then we will talk about taste.
Okay. Well, I mean, it might be interesting because you get the fattiness of the butter with the sweetness of the honey. All right.
When you make, ideally, it's got to be fresh bread though, or like microwave it a bit, because like it's when I have a bread maker. So when I make fresh bread and you cut the first piece, honey and butter, so good.
All right.
Hello.
Hey.
Hello.
This is the mini little Louis Esser.
Yeah.
She gets our emails every Saturday.
Big eyes, very big eyes.
Yeah, I was about to say giant eyes.
Eyes like her dad, and eyelashes. Yeah, this is
lots of hair.
Yeah, great head of hair. Yeah, so this
is
her,
her, not you.
I know, but my head of hair has also grown in COVID. But last time she came on, she was like a pipsqueak. Now she's a full-fledged person. She's very cute. Yeah. How are you guys?
Wait a minute. Are we past what? When did I start doing this job? No, it was February. Okay. I was like, hang on. Is she a year old? What's happening?
Oh, no.
Okay.
She's 3 months.
I got scared.
Yeah.
She's scared about the passage of time.
She's 3 months now, but like it's amazing how like every week is a new something for sure. Yeah.
Does she do anything interesting yet? Does she crawl?
Not crawl, no. She's cooing. Like that's the thing. It's like, oh. So she's like finding her voice. And then soon she'll start to laugh, but it's very fun. I mean, she does it often, but especially here, you can see her when she, it's more like when she's going to sleep and she's like in her swaddle and everything. And she's like very cute. She's, and I recorded it the other day. And my mother was like, the things now that we're entertained by, but it's great. Yeah.
The crawling doesn't start for a while.
But yeah. And now she like has much stronger neck. Like we can, but sit her, like we assisted sitting and everything, but by 6 months she'll do it by herself, and then she'll start to crawl and like very small little changes. But now she like knows who we are. It's funner more like to interact with her now because she's interacting with us as opposed to just being like a total
less one-sided. Yeah
exactly.
Okay, we have run out of time. Final reminder to our viewers: get vaccinated. It's the only way that we can slow down the variants. Don't listen to the silly stuff from the anti-vaxxers. Go and get vaccinated. All right. That's it. We'll see you all in a couple of weeks. Bye.